back. Okay, excellent. How's it online? Not that I can see your reply. I hope that this is picking up okay. All right. My name's Dorothea. I'm one of the owners here. It's just so great to be in shared space again. Feels like a long time since we wrapped up our spring event series, and I'm just really happy that we're now resuming in part in person. Also glad that so many of you are able to join from wherever you are tonight. A word for the online audience: the interface of our platform looks a little different than it did. So if you're looking for how to ask the question, and I hope you'll queue up your questions as you have them. The button for that is now on the bottom right where there's a chat box. And there's just a little question mark. Click on that, write your question, and we'll hope to leave time for those during the Q&A. I want to flag for you that we have a sign-up sheet for our events, and we have a lot coming up in the next weeks and months. It's by the books in the back. And as always, and as ever more it seems, many of our events are close collaborations with our partners at the Princeton Public Library. This event is one of those. We call them Labyrinth Live at the Library, or Library Live at Labyrinth, and we don't really care which way they go, which is the beauty of this collaboration. Wonderful. So shout out to Jamie, my honorary colleague. Also co-sponsoring tonight is similarly, they are partners in crime for a lot of what we do, and that includes a lot of events in our lineup this fall. So if you don't get an email from us once a week, give us your email address. But now on to our guests. There's no good accounting for why it's taken me until now to read Yiyun Li's work. And there's also no good accounting for why I didn't read Idra Novey's novels and poems sooner. Each in her own right is, after all, a powerful writer of her time, whose books I won't list, but I invite you to browse them in the back if you're online. They're a click away. Make sure you check them out. And both have been teaching at Princeton University for many years. My reward for my belatedness is that there has been a real sense of discovery for me in reading Yiyun's new novel, and that I now have her and also Idra's work waiting for me to continue to discover. I can't therefore say very much in general about Yiyun's work, but I do want to say a few brief words about her marvelous new book, Book of Goose, which we're celebrating tonight. The title sits at an oblique angle at the head of this disquieting tale set in postwar France. It's the tale of a remembered friendship in childhood and adolescence between two girls who need each other and between whom the power is unevenly distributed. It opens strangely, beautifully, alarmingly, with a riff on incisions on what's oblique and what's acute, what's soft, what's hard, and what cuts into what. Thistles, bees, mud, poverty in a rural setting, death, decay, all of this marks the setting for the story about a self relinquished to another self, for whom manipulation is a way of life, and about art as the most serious game we might play. There's a biblical echo to the book, I hear the Book of Job, which points to a way of unmerited suffering, though when is suffering merited? But the geese, which actually figure fascinatingly little in this book, are the narrator's chosen charges in the chosen exile from where she finds her own writing voice, only once her childhood friend has died, a death that launches the story. So the geese stand maybe too for a kind of recuperation of self in the recording of a tale of having been the plaything scribe to a fiendish, darkly turned quasi-feral girl when they were both very young. I'm going to quote, "The secret of being Fabienne's true friend," says Agnes, the narrator, "was to stay still in her shadow, to be as empty as the air around her, and to be everywhere with her. I couldn't help in reading allowing these symbiotic girls to be a single figure in my mind, which was just one of the ways in which the novel, with its deceptively straightforward and stable language remains ever strange and multiplies its questions without, I think, being all that interested in any straight answers. I'm sure that the conversation between our two wonderful guests now is bound to take us also into many other directions and explore many other themes of this amazingly novel. So I invite you please to help me welcome both of them.
Thank you. Hello, thank you everyone. It's so wonderful to see everyone here on such a beautiful day outside. Thank you for joining me, Dorothea, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you, Janine, for the library support. It's wonderful to see everyone in person now after 2.5 years. So I thought I would just read the opening of the book. So just a couple pages so you can hear her voice, the narrator's voice. You cannot cut an apple with an apple. You cannot cut an orange with an orange. You can, if you have a knife, cut an apple or an orange, or slice open the underbelly of a fish, or if your hands are steady enough and the blade is sharp enough, sever an umbilical cord. You can slash a book. There are different ways to measure depth, but now many readers measure a book's depth with a knife, making a cut from the first page all the way down to the last. Why not wonder? You can hand a knife to another person, betting with yourself how deep a wound he or she is willing to inflict. You can be the inflictor of the wound. One half orange plus another half orange do not make a full orange again, and that is where my story begins. An orange that did not think itself good enough for a knife. An orange that never dreamed of turning itself into a knife. Cut and be cut. Neither interested me back then. My name is Agnes, but that is not important. You can go into an orchard with a list of names and write them on the oranges, François and Pierre and Diane and Louise. But what difference does it make? What matters to an orange is its orangeness. The same with me. My name could have been Clementine, or Odette, or Henrietta. But so? An orange is just an orange. As a doll is a doll. Don't think that once you name a doll, it is different from other dolls. You can bathe it and close it and feed it empty air and put it to bed with the lullabies you imagine a mother should be singing to a baby. All the same, the doll, like all dolls, cannot be called dead, as it was never alive. The name you should pay attention to in this story is Fabienne. Fabienne is not an orange or a knife or a singer of lullabies. She can make herself into any one of those things. Well, once could. She's dead now. The news of her death arrived in a letter from my mother, the last of my family still living in Saint-Remy, though my mother was not writing particularly to report the death, but the birth of her own first great-grandchild. Had I remained near her, she would have questioned why I have not given birth to a baby to be added to her collection of grandchildren. This is one good thing about living in America. I'm too far away to be her concern. But long before my marriage, I stopped being her concern. My fate took care of that. America and fame, they're equally useful if you want freedom from your mother. Just one little episode. How do you grow happiness? Fabian asked. We were 13 then, but we felt older. Our bodies, I now know, were underdeveloped, the way children born in the wartime and growing up in poverty are, with more years crammed into their brains. Well-proportioned we were not. Well-proportioned children are rare. War guarantees disproportion, but during peacetime, other things go wrong. I have not met a child who's not lopsided in some way. And when children grow up, they become lopsided adults. Can you grow happiness? I asked. You can grow anything, just like potatoes, Fabian said. I thought she would have a better answer, growing happiness on the top of a maple, or in a wren's nest, or between two rocks in a creek. Happiness should not be dirt-colored and hidden underground. Even apples on a branch would be better suited to be called happiness than apples in the earth. Though if happiness were like apples, I thought, it would be quite ordinary and uninteresting. You don't believe me? Fabian said. I have an idea. We grow your happiness as beet and mine as potato. If one crop fails, we still have the other. We won't be starved. What if both fail? I asked. We'll become butchers. Thank you. Okay. Hello.
Wow, that was so wonderful to hear you read from this. I love this novel. I've read it twice, and for those of you who haven't read it yet, you're really in for a spectacular experience. For my first question, I remember having lunch with you when you were working on this novel, and you told me about this French novel you found by a rural girl, and the spectacle of intrigue, that it produced when it came out. And so I think for those of you, just if you to tell them a little bit about that, and how it led you to sort of conjure your own far more fascinating, complex version, not with one girl writing the book, but with two. And so it becomes this sort of two-headed dragon with these two girls creating this book together from when real life was one. And I was just thinking about that. I was rereading the Tolstoy Together, which is this museum that Yiyun put together, reading Tolstoy with readers online during the pandemic. And she provided these fabulous insights into rereading War and Peace. And one of them is about a scene where Prince Andrei observes these two girls stealing plums together, the plum stealing girls. And this observation you had about those plum stealing girls, I wondered if there might be a bit of a parallel between them and these two girls and the Book of Goose. And what you said that Prince Andrei realized the existence of other human interests watching them, totally foreign to him and as legitimate as those interests that concern him. And so I think what Tolstoy observes, in that moment with Prince Andrei watching them, transgression of these two plum-stealing girls. And you wrote about this transgression of Agnes and Fabian. And I think instead of stealing plums, what they steal is sort of this forbidden act of imagination. And in taking their imagination seriously, they sort of take themselves seriously. So anyway, that's
That's a very good articulated interpretation of the seed of the book. So I guess the seed of the book is I read in a review. It is a Bowman reviewed 4 French authors, all of them under age 15 in 1950s. The youngest one was 9. And Bowen did not think highly of those children. And partly is the French culture, they're always into prodigies. And these were really terrible prodigies. And Bowen wrote very harshly of these young authors. And Francoise Sagan was already famous at the time, 19. And she said, well, these authors, make Sagan look like a middle-aged woman. And so I look at it for young prodigies. One of them was from the countryside, French countryside, and she published 2 novels. She became an international bestseller. She was translated into English by actually Diana Atfield. Of all the people, Diana Atfield translated her. And Time magazine sent photographers to photograph her. And eventually it turned out she couldn't write. It was a hoax. The village postmaster wrote for her. But it was post-World War II American occupation in the French countryside. It had all the elements for the book to be a bestseller. So that was how the book became a bestseller. I thought it was interesting episode in history, but she disappeared from history. Anytime someone disappears from history, I think it's a good moment for novelists. Nobody knew her. Nobody has heard of her. So I thought I would just take this background, this little seed, and grow my own novel. But it's very important, as you pointed out. Right away, it was a novel. It was a 2 girls story. It was not Agnes' story. It's Fabienne plus Agnes. And I think partly, as you said, in that War and Peace episode, was Prince Andre went back to his estate. He saw 2 slave girls stealing plums, and they were edging each other, right? They were also protecting each other, and they were giggling. And there was something about girls between age 12 and 14. They have all the imaginations to make an entire world for themselves. So I thought that's a good place to start. And in fact, the writing of the novel, the reason I read that part when she said, how do you grow happiness? We'll grow your happiness as potatoes and mine as beets. That was the very first conversation from the 2 characters coming to my mind. Before I even knew what the story would be like, I heard them. It sounds terrible, but I did hear them talking about growing happiness and making nonsense. I think the other thing we forget, children, they are at an age they can make a lot of nonsense, but it's by making nonsense that make sense of the world. And I think we actually sometimes forget how to make nonsense. And so I sort of just went back to that age, to that time, and how we can make nonsense. And that's where the 2 girls came into the novel.
Well, and in Tolstoy Together, you talk about good nonsense and sense in a similar way. So that's something that seems like you look for in other books as well.
Yes, I think, oftentimes I do look for, I said common nonsense or non-common sense. I'm not interested in common sense. Common sense can make very boring tales. So I think for these 2 girls is the common nonsense between them. They can make up all this nonsense, but it makes sense for them, right? It's their entire world. It's not the countryside. It's not the village. It's not the school. It's that world they too create by their imagination and their own vocabulary. Children oftentimes do have their own vocabularies, and I think that's one thing that was really wonderful is they understand each other in the way that they already have shared vocabularies since the very beginning of their works.
Well, when you're talking about how rich their vocabulary is and how complex their imaginations are and how they sort of deepen each other's imaginations, I thought that it's done with such reverence for them in the novel, and you subvert the usual caricatures of rural children, which you see so often in fiction, here and elsewhere. And they're often rural children are portrayed as intellectually inferior, but not in this book, And I think you capture that there's this acceptable contempt that they often receive in educational settings, and how often if they have unsophisticated clothing or their manners aren't, urban manners, that's often falsely equated with their intellectual abilities. And so you capture that contempt so potently with the character of Mrs. Townsend, who, for those who haven't read it yet, she runs this boarding school where Agnes is set in the second half of the novel. And Mrs. Townsend, observing Agnes coming, from the countryside to school, says that she has a primitive mind, a feral appearance, she's nearly illiterate, and has a tendency. And she comes to read this about herself. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you have this reverence for this rich vocabulary they create for themselves, and at the same time, there are characters like Mrs. Townsend who come, with such contempt and such condescension. And I was thinking how you explore this a little bit with Ruyu and Kinder Than Solitude, because Shawai often refers to her as provincial, and her reactions to Ruyu are often based on seeing her in a provincial light. So in some ways, it seems like something you've written about, that contempt in other books too.
Right, contempt is such an interesting thing, right? I just shared a story. Do you think I can share the story of the Danish?
Yes.
I years ago I did a book panel with Marilyn Robinson in Denmark and about reading as a child. And so when I was 9, there were no children's books for me. So I read whatever newspapers published. So Tolstoy's Resurrection was theorized in the newspaper. You can laugh, yes. And I was 9. I found Resurrection such a great novel. It was full of seduction and, all these mysteries. So in Denmark, I said I was 9, I was in Beijing, I was reading, Resurrection. And the panelist, the woman who actually, she turned out to be a right-wing journalist. So she just looked at me and then she looked at the audience. She said, no, we're talking about Tolstoy. How much do you think a 9-year-old in Beijing could understand Tolstoy? And I said, more than you can ever imagine. And so I feel that that's the kind of the contempt that people just, I think it's a sort of a set mind, as you said, people from the countryside, people from the third world country, they don't have imagination or understanding, which is exactly not true, because I think what those girls don't have in the book is they don't have the vocabularies spoken by the Parisians or by the English people. They have their own vocabularies. And sometimes they feel so much, and I do find children interesting in that way. Their understanding and their thinking are way ahead of their vocabulary. So they cannot articulate what they think and how they feel. But that doesn't mean they cannot feel it. So I guess it's interesting you said my respect for the girls, because I knew exactly what they felt at that age, and I think they feel the whole world. They feel everything in the world, right? They would go to the graveyard. They would talk about death. They would make up games with dead people and dead animals. That's their world, and they feel everything.
Yes, and I think that the way that they give their language and their reactions are circumscribed, the way that children who are readily observed all the time are. When you grow up and you're just, I grew up in a very rural place, and so when you play in the woods all the time, nobody's setting the terms. There's no perimeter that you play within. There's no perimeter at all. So I think that also changes the way you think. If your childhood has sort of an edge to it, a border of a yard or a playground, it's very different when you can just run as far as you can. And I think it changes the way you think too. And you really honor that and how you write them.
Yes, and it's interesting because when a book comes out, oftentimes you do those pre-pub interviews. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes people ask one question. I find it's a fascinating question. They say, you did not grow up in rural France. How could you have written France in such a good way? And I thought, that is a question asked exactly from your point of view, from the set vocabulary. Yeah. But Fabian and Agnes, they would never put their own lives in a historical background. They would never think of themselves as girls growing up in French countryside, post-World War II, during American occupation. Those are all words, given by the world to them. They did not look at the world and think about, we occupy this important historical moment. Their entire world is that countryside. It's their pigs and and cows and babies. There was one moment, I think, Agnes, towards the end, she said, other girls, and she went to English finishing school. She said, they are the flowers. We are the rot underneath those flowers. And that's the real world for them. But that's how they live. And they would not frame that in a historical, from a historical point of view. So
Well, rot and the roots, because flowers can be blown away. So there's
the
that.
roots, yes.
This is another sort of language vocabulary related question. A couple years ago, you did it more than a couple years ago, an interview where you said that literary legacy in your case was choice, and that you began writing in your late 20s when you were old enough to choose your literary genes. And I wondered how that plays out in some ways in this novel. For Agnes, because if this novel in some ways is sort of about her choosing her literary legacy. She comes to live in another language in another country. The novel ends with her as an adult in Pennsylvania. And she has a literary legacy of choosing Fabian's assistance, even though it's posthumous. Fabian has already died, and she sees her as a posthumous influence and as her literary legacy. So my two questions for you is just sort of how you see that question of sort of choosing one's literary legacy in this novel, and also if you think of sort of the opportunity to live at a remove from the language of one's childhood, if that does create an opportunity to choose your literary genes.
Right, that's such a good question. And I mean, certainly, I think if you look like me, when you write, people would always mention Amy Tan to your ear, right? There's no offense to Amy Tan, but I would say my legacy, my reading is Russian novels. I read Russian novels and Irish novels. I count Russian writers and Irish writers my biggest influence. I think we often forget how a writer, is different than his or her background. Just, because I saw Paul there, I just have to share this. The great Irish writer, William Trevor, when I met him when he was in his late 70s and became friends with him. And he said, well, if you're an Irish writer, especially if you're an Irish short story writer, everybody will ask about Joyce, right? The influence of Joyce on you. He actually, when he first started, he said he was heavily influenced by Carson McCullers. Of all the people in the world, it's an American writer who wrote about the South of America. That resonated with young William Trevor. So I thought, that's exactly right. You read for different reasons, and I think, of course, we read and then we write. And when I write, I aspire to write like Russian writers and Irish writers, and that's my sort of. Sometimes I wonder if we can have a genealogy just by books we read. That would be like a dream world, right? Not by your blood, or by parents. That's my nerdy wish.
You can send away, a sample and find out your DNA of like who you're related to. What if you could send your writing somewhere? Like your literary DNA, and someone could do a diagnostics on it and say, like, I see a dash Williams over here, some Garcia Marquez.
Okay, that is a very good idea. We should just start a startup. For writers.
Well, discover your true literary DNA.
Yes, but I haven't answered your second question, which is, choosing another language. You're right. Agnes, in the end, ended up in Pennsylvania, and she wrote this book in English. She had a particular way of speaking English because she also went through the education in the English finishing school. So I have written about this, extensively. Just not using mother tongue to write. There are complications with that. But for myself, it is just the best choice I've done for myself. It's not to use Chinese to write, just to turn into English. As you said, I came into English when I was in my 20s. I bypassed my childhood in English. I did not have the intimacy with English language. So English always been new. Every day it's new. I'm looking up at dictionaries all the time. Just words, every single word has to be understood by me before I can use them. I think if you are speaking in your mother language or writing in your mother language, sometimes you take shortcuts, right? this is how other people say it, and you would say it. No, every word has to be studied before it's a word to me. So I think I treat English with extreme care, I would say.
And I think for Agnes, with her literary legacy, it's so confusing with the button. I try to make up a way to remember that. I forgot. That she associates herself with this childhood, but she's also, as you're saying, she's in some ways estranged from it because she's living and writing in another language in another country. She is in a rural place, it's like rural Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. And so she, when she's writing about it, she is in a place where she's reconnecting with geese. She's reconnecting with animals. And so there is some of that sort of intrinsic language of childhood that is wordless, that she's then capturing in English, because I think she's going back to sort of like a more physical language, like this language of the body and of this interacting with the animals, because they don't, I think my dog is bilingual. You can talk to him in Spanish and English. He will maybe do what you ask. But in general, they're just listening to your tone. So in a way, she's writing to this sort of like this language of the countryside.
Yes, the language of the countryside is exactly right. So she started to keep these geese, and she gave them French name. But she has this description of, she said people call geese, aggressive, but geese are geese can be aggressive, but they're also peaceful. And they're also just quiet. They don't have to be like chickens. She said, my chickens talk all the time and very agitated, but my geese, they can dream forever in the pond. And I think that's the kind of self she has, reconnected with the countryside, with the
and I do, we will make sure we have time to ask questions from the audience too, is this question of the geese, which I know you had this title before you wrote the book. Right. So you've been waiting for this goosey novel.
Can I just be very, very, very trivial and just show off my geese bag? Yeah, goose bag. I've been carrying this bag for several months, traveling with the bags, because exactly, I have to, can I just make a confession, because this is hometown audience, so I have not said this anywhere else. There is, that photographer, Peter Huja, he has photographed some farm animals, and my most favorite photograph from him is called Goose from Germantown, Pennsylvania. And there are two of them. One is in a museum in Harvard University. The other one was in private collection. I fell in love with the other one so hard. I look at that goose all the time. I just, for some reason, I thought my entire soul is in that goose. And so I started to think I wanted to write a book called The Book of Goose, only because I could not afford that goose. That went on to auction the summer I was working on the novel, 2021. It went on to auction and it sold 15,000 euros or 20,000 euros. But, in any case, it's a lot of money for a goose. So I decided to write my own book. I just want to honor my love of that goose, but I also did think, if you have an opportunity, just look at that picture. That goose is funny, mysterious, quiet, but also naughty. But everything about human being or human nature or everything I imagine myself to be is in that goose. So yes.
Well, when we were talking about goosiness as such, and there's this wonderful moment where, and towards the end of the novel, where she's sort of talking about the importance of being able to be a silly goose as an adult, and that you can't really make art unless you are willing to continue to be a silly goose, which both of us believe is extremely important every day. And I was just thinking about how one learns that ability to be a silly goose as a kid, and one of the other sort of subtle things about geese in the novel that you sort of create this correlate between childhood and flights of imagination. And the geese, because they fly, and I was like, there's sort of a connection between the geese representing flight and the flight of imagination, which is the way that you learn to sort of be silly and do playfulness, because I think imagination is play. And so that seems to be the way that they sort of have between them, that they find happiness, which is another sort of that piece you read from the beginning of the book. And then towards the end of the book, there's sort of a return to this question that of sort of the imagination of happiness is the most fragile kind. And that really stayed with me. And I know a friend of mine here is like, it's really hard to write about happiness. The imagination of happiness is so fragile, and yet that was the pursuit of this book in some ways.
The imagination of happiness, that's exactly right. I sometimes I teach some of my students are in the audience. I always quote Elizabeth Baldwin. She says, at the beginning of a novel, a character or characters should have alternatives. And as the novel progresses, the characters lose their alternatives. In the end, they don't have any alternatives. But I think in most cases, I think Bowen is right. Characters should come with alternatives. But these two characters are very special to me because they did not start with alternatives. They're just countryside girls. They had no alternatives. Their life was set from the very beginning. They were going to work on the farm until they were old enough to be married off. And their first children were dying. The entire thing was set for them. The interesting thing is, they wanted alternatives, and they took it in their own hands. They said, let's conjure up alternatives for ourselves by writing a book. Send you out to Paris, became a celebrity. It's the entire thing is their imagination, it's their desire for an alternative.
And also the imagination, which is abstract, actually leads to concrete actions. And even though it starts as a flight of imagination, she actually does fly to another place. In the end, it does actually lead to realizing other realities. The other thing I really loved about their relationship has to do with the lack of alternatives in an isolated place and how they're supposed to just marry and breed and sort of join the farmyard. And it just, because of their isolation and their friendship, they have this ambivalence where the harshness they feel around them leads them, as you described sort of the end of the book, where they're sort of ambivalent about whether to embrace or kill each other. And I think it's like how stifled they feel ends up sort of working itself out between them, because it's the only place they have any freedom is between them. And so all these constraints end up sort of manifesting between each other, where they're trying to fulfill all their needs from each other. And it's doomed because they can't enact everything between them.
Yes. I do think I often think about it. They were happiest before they started writing that book.
Yeah.
They were in their own world, making up all this nonsense. And the moment you start making changes to that happiness, and you're right. And I think in the end, that happiness turned out to be as fragile as anybody's happiness. It's not sustainable. And now they're no longer 12, they're no longer 14, they're going on 15, 16, people are going to marry them off. So I'm so glad you mentioned a lot towards the end. I can't give you away the last sentence, so you can read the book and find the last sentence. I would say writing that last sentence deeply wounded me. It was, I wrote that sentence and I went to the swimming pool because I couldn't recover. So I went to the swimming pool. I jumped in the pool and I couldn't swim. I did not know how to swim. I had to go home and look at them once again. Because there was something so important between them. And they had to come in and kill it off as a little bit of different older girls.
Yeah, and I never read, I maybe catch my breath too, because I was like, oh yes, that is what happened. And I could go through my mind and think of all these relationships where they sort of, all these sort of lack of alternatives, you try and work them out in the friendship, and then the friendship can't sustain all of it, and then it implodes. And very much the relationship between them implodes as a result from wanting to get so many things from it that they can't get elsewhere.
Yeah. So, that's, again, they run out of alternatives. They made up all these alternatives. You run out of alternatives. Yeah.
And I know I switched to questions. I see Dorothy, she's getting ready to get audience questions. But just one last one.
Take your time.
Is, I know some people have made comparisons. This is sort of like your Elena Ferrante novel. I found it so different in part because, yes, there's so many things about sort of the sensuality of the relationship, sort of like erotic charge between the girls, like all these aspects of the intensity of the friendship, of going through how the relationship implodes, puberty approaches. But beyond that, I do think this is very much about, girls in the place of isolation, whereas in Ferrante's novels, it's urban girls. They're, you know, they're in a city and they're constantly surrounded by other people in a very different way. So it felt very, people made that comparison. I was like, yes. However, it felt very different to me. They didn't have a relationship with the animals and you know, slaughtering animals all the time. It's just like a very different environment.
It's interesting because I didn't even think about Ferrante when I was working on a novel. And then when I turned in the draft, my editor said, oh, that's a little bit Yiyun Ferrante. Huh, very good. I didn't realize that. And I think, you know, I think it's a great thing I didn't think, because if I was thinking I would write the next, you know, Yiyun Ferrante, I would never write that. I would not be able to write. So I think it's a great thing. And I'm glad people are making a connection or comparison.
But I think it also goes to, because they're such radically different books, that we don't have enough novels about female friendships at that age, and the intensity and how drastically they implode. So the two books that are so different are compared, and they don't actually have that much in common. I think it speaks to the fact that we don't have that many books about that, because otherwise there won't book.
And that's true. But can I compare it to another book, which actually, speaking of literature legacy, I think towards the end of her career, Elisa Bowen wrote a book called The Little Girls. And it was not about two girls, about three girls in the English countryside. The book did not work. You know, I love Bowen. I'm probably the biggest fan of Bowen in the world. Still, I would say that book did not work. Just somehow did not work. So, yes, if I say, you know, I'm writing this book, maybe I'm just writing this book just to make sure I can have a conversation with Bowen's book. And also knowing maybe I can write a better book than that.
Well, it's spectacular. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, it's so, it's just unlike anything else. I mean, I think I related to it in so many different levels, but it isn't like, I haven't read the Bowen books, but now neat, because I love it. But it's really spectacular. Should we take some?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to listen to the two of you, also because I realized that I had so much a darker reading of the book, and so now I, you know, in terms of the imagination as a real power, but also a very dark power, in equal measure to it being a bright force. So now I will reread with your conversation in my mind, and open it up to questions from all of you. Here's one.
I have a question. I read an article about you several weeks ago, and there was a line in there that connected with me and actually brought me here. And it was about your writing process. And in the article, you made a comment about how sometimes it takes you, or it can take you, a month to work on a paragraph. And I don't remember the sentence before or after, but it made it sound as if that's not something you've always done, like I guess in your progress or as you have grown and such, that is something that you do now, maybe your time, I don't know. And so I was curious about how your writing process has changed over time.
That's, you know. Right. So, yeah, I do think, you know, I'm sure Idra can share this too. We grow as writers, we have changed. You know, when I was younger, when I was beginning, I paid a lot of attention to crafts. You know, I think as a newcomer to writing, you wanted to make sure the crafts was right. And these days, I think it's more about living in the character. Mm-hmm. You know, you just want to get it right how they feel. Sometimes it does take a day or sometimes a week just to get one sentence right, because I come from the point of view, I feel that the characters, I work for the characters. You know, I heard a talk, the Kazuo Ishiguro said something that's so fascinating. He said, well, the characters have to audition with me. And I had to decide if they're good enough to be in the book. I thought, oh, you are much more in control than I am. I'm not in control. I'm auditioning for the characters or for me to tell their stories. So I think my process these days mostly just to live in the characters as much as I can. You know, just to be in their world, to talk like them, feel like them. So writing has become both slower and faster. Once you're in the character's head, I think you can just live there. You can just tell their story. It's not my story. So it's all different writers have different.
Thank you.
Let me come around to you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So when Fabienne is in the boarding school, the finishing school, she encounters something that she thinks of as bad nonsense, that she contrasts with the good nonsense she had with Agnes. What's the difference between bad nonsense and good nonsense?
Oh my God, he should have warned me. There's the smartest writer. What is good nonsense? What is bad nonsense? I think when she's in the finishing school, those girls are really nonsensical, right? They talk about dances, they talk about their clothes. I think bad nonsense are their way to fit into a mold the world wants them to be. Whether they're from Argentina, they're going to go back to start a school for the deaf and blind. It sounds fabulous, but they don't have imagination. They feel that the world wants them to be like that. So they make all these bad nonsense. I think good nonsense are always for ourselves. When Fabienne and Agnes are making those nonsense, they're not entertaining anyone but themselves. So I do think my goal in writing not only this book, but all the books is I want to make good nonsense, for myself, not bad nonsense for the world. Very good question.
That's a brilliant line. You've already had so many beautiful closing lines, but I don't want to end. So I want to see if there are other questions. Are there here?
Hi, I've been a loyal fan since 2 years ago. I have a question. So I like to, nothing against paper books. I like audiobooks as well. So I have all your audiobooks. Can I just ask, do you have a say on picking who will read your books at the official Audible?
Do you hate my audiobooks?
Just saying, I have my preference. When you read it, right? When you read it, I think one of your recite one audiobook, she's particularly good. She's Cassandra Campbell. Yeah, I think the way you read and the way she really can deliver. I mean, the new book, I just got this book, audiobook, and now I know there's trying to be a French accent. It just somehow it's a little bit bothersome.
Well, I do have, audiobook is interesting but that's also interesting because I don't listen to the audiobooks when I book. Not because I have my own voice reading the book. So it's my voice, but it's also a little different from the speaking voice. So, but I don't have a lot of control, but I did listen to all the, my dream reader is Julia Stevenson.
Yes.
And I know, I listen to all the Julia Stevenson's recording, not because some of the books are not great, but I just like her voice so much. I did ask my publisher, I said, but we felt Julia Stevenson was not a great reader, would not be a right reader for this book. So we did go for an actress who's bilingual. She lives in Paris. She speaks French and she speaks English, which, deliver that French accent in English. So the answer is no, I don't know my audiobook. They're a different.
Thank you. It's a wonderful talk. Thank you. I understand that you came from China, and so English is not your first language. And also you touch upon the topic that you shift your writing from Chinese to English. So in the process, do you feel that you are sufficient to write in this acquired language?
No, I want to make a sort of just a revision of the question. Is after I've never written in Chinese. I mean, I grew up in China. I could write in Chinese, but I've never written creatively in Chinese. So Chinese is not a creative language for me. It's not a fiction writing language. So English is not my first language, but it's my first language in writing. And I think in English. I dream in English. I curse in English. Someone told me when you curse in English, that's probably, the language is very close to you. I think that's right. So I don't think about a sufficient question, only because when you think about it, you're saying, Idra is the native speaker. If I think, is my English sufficient? I mean, Idra has something more. No, we're equally, thoughtful in our language. So I don't ask that question. And certainly, there are ways to work around a non-native language in writing. So.
Also, there's many people whose first language is English and who aren't sufficient in it.
Also, some of the greatest writers were non-native speakers.
Yes.
Conrad.
That's right.
Yiyun Li.
I'll say that clearly you also tell jokes in English, which I think is another indicator.
Thank you. I do my math in Chinese. I realize that really marks you as a native speaker, so how you do math.
I'm a math teacher. And I read a book from this library, from this bookstore, actually that I purchased, and it years ago. But when you mentioned this, it reminded me that it's the linguistics of how they name words. The numbers are different in, of course, many different languages, but the structures create and ease. The economy of expression for numbers creates different thinking structures and capacities for our minds. And so, it makes sense to me that you're doing math in Chinese. There's an economy of thought in the economy of words and for the numbers and the operations.
Thank you.
How do you say it?
I can never count in French, by the way. You know how to count in French once you reach 99.
I also count in German. Another case in point.
Thank you for speaking to us about the power of imagination. I feel like that's really something that I'm trying to reconnect back with, because I feel like I'm really, really self-conscious when I'm writing about is the tone right? Am I a serious writer? Slipping into the kind of as a student, it's really hard for me to get over these mental blocks whenever I write. So do you have any strategies for tapping into that childlike imagination and being able to write creatively without being hindered by expectations of what you should be writing or who you should be writing for?
I think he's helping.
Yeah, it's funny. You go to Princeton, right? Yes. I think part of the reason, the expectations that you have to go through all these hoops of expectations to get to Princeton, right? But I think that the most important thing is joy. I think writing is not to say, am I good enough? Is this tone the right tone? Is this voice good? Is this a good, writer's choice point of view? Those are all good. Those are fine questions, but they're not interesting questions. Mm-hmm. I don't think, I mean, there are writers who may get joy out of thinking, should I write a first-person narrator? Should I write a third-person narrator? Or a second? Those are technical questions. They don't give you joy. And I say that to my students. I really just want them to enjoy. Writing is a long career. it's not, it's not like you run a race, right? 100 meters, you have to dash there. You can take your time. But the most important thing is, I think, when you write something, it has to make you happy. You know, it has to make you forget lunch, or it has to make you forget, you know, your friend is waiting for you at a party. There's something, writing is somewhere you can get lost. And I think that joy of getting lost is the most important thing, especially at your age. Don't put too much pressure on yourself.
So we have time for one more question.
I have thoroughly enjoyed your book, and I got lost in it last night, and I finished it at 10 minutes of 1. And I like what you say about getting lost in writing, and I think that connects with his questions about imagination and the question about writing in what language. And I say this from a perspective of an ESL teacher, that a Chinese student of mine, who I think is contemporary age-wise with you, said that in Chinese, she was never allowed to have an imagination and never nurtured any kind of creativity or joy. And coming to this country and learning English, it was a whole different thing. And her children were growing up being asked to think and be creative. And that whole idea of creativity was new to her. And I think that your girls in the book have that creativity. And it's almost, well, I don't know where my question is going. But I guess I just want to say I enjoyed all that creativity and looking for joy in their lives. And I escaped beautifully into the book.
Oh, I think that's such a wonderful thing to say. Thank you very much. I also thought that might be a good place to.
For sure.
Yeah. Yes, welcome you to escape and to get lost with those two girls.
So before I invite you to thank both Idra and Yiyun, I will say that you just heard that the photograph that inspired this book cost 15,000 euros. You can get the book itself for the bargain price of 28,000. All to say that you can get a book and get it signed. I'll ask you to come. I'll go back there. Okay. Just pay on your way out. Order it online. Pay online. We will turn the tables on Yiyun and Idra when Idra's new novel comes out in the spring. Do you want to share the title?
It's called Take What You Need, also set in Western Pennsylvania. Novels, and it will be out in March.
Yeah, so the two of them will be talking about that in March, and lucky us to have them here tonight and to look forward to that. Thank you.